So I decided to talk about Romans 9.
Let's look at Romans chapter 9.
Today we're going to be looking at Romans chapter 9.
Today we're going to look at Romans chapter 9.
Well, so there's this passage in Romans 9.
In case you're not familiar with Romans 9.
And in fact, when we examine Romans chapter 9,
Jacob I loved, Esau I hated.
Well, I'd like to suggest for your consideration a very different reading of Romans 9 than the one that we so often hear.
Grace and peace, fellow believers in Christ Jesus. You just heard Dr. William Lane Craig say that he was about to present a very different view on Romans 9 than the one we've heard so often, most likely referring to the Calvinistic one. His view pretty much aligns with Mike Winger's and Leighton Flowers' view because Winger, Flowers, and Craig all believe in man's redemptive free will, and therefore all view Jacob and Esau very similarly. For them, Paul is saying that Jacob equals the nation of Israel, chosen by God to bring forth the Messiah, and is therefore loved, while Esau equals the nation of Edom, not chosen to bring forth the Messiah, and is therefore hated. In contrast, James White, John Piper, the late R.C. Sproul, Paul Washer, and just about any other Calvinist teacher you can find, all see Jacob and Esau completely differently. For them, Paul's point is that Jacob represents the elect, whom God chose before the foundation and loves, and Esau represents the non-elect, anyone he didn't choose and therefore hates. With that dichotomy in mind, Romans 9:13 becomes a highly contentious verse. Before I offer an alternative view to both, I will break down both views because each one contains elements that are true and elements that are false. Both sides affirm that the Jacob and Esau quote is not about the fate of the two brothers personally. Both sides agree that the twins represent something outside of themselves. Here is how they differ, though. The non-Calvinist sees the twins as two nations, one chosen to bring forth Messiah through genealogy, making the twins to be prophetic in nature and pointing to the time of Jesus' first coming. The Calvinist says that Jacob and Esau is not prophetic, but is simply explanatory, having to do with the salvation, or lack thereof, of individuals, from Adam to the final judgment, regardless of time frames or covenant. Or unless the Calvinist is ready to call what they claim to be the elect and the reprobate two nations, I'm not sure how they can arrive at their conclusion. Romans chapters 1 through 11 do almost nothing but contrast national Israel and Gentiles. Individual predestination has absolutely nothing to do with Paul's treatise. This view is simply untenable. Those who reject predestination correctly see the twins as nations, just as God said, and therefore conclude that Jacob is Israel. What other nation could Jacob possibly be? However, when it comes to concepts, we all know that Paul can be deep. But think about God and how deep God can be. Good writers always have a twist in their plot, something revealed toward the end of the story you couldn't have imagined earlier. We need to think like God thinks when we read God's book, and Paul was obviously in tune with God as he wrote. I submit to you that there is a twist to this narrative, and once you see it, you will not be able to unsee it. Let's see how Paul concludes his thoughts. Romans 9:30 and 32 says, "What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness of faith. But Israel, pursuing the law of righteousness, has not attained to the law of righteousness. Why? Because they did not seek it by faith, but as it were, by the works of the law. For they stumbled at that stumbling stone." Israel versus Gentiles. That is the contrast in Paul's conclusion, and it's obviously about salvation. But it's not about individual salvation, but about one nation, Israel, and Gentiles who are not a nation, but can be from any nation. And the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. The wrestling twins in the womb of Rebekah were to become 2 nations according to God. But there is an ironic twist to God's narrative that most miss regarding what nations they become. Let us briefly look at the story that takes us from Abraham to Israel. As Isaac's sons, the twins were the grandsons of Abraham, who had been promised both to possess a land and to become a great nation at the first. Sarai was barren, so he slept with her handmaiden Hagar, and for 13 years Abraham thought Ishmael would be his heir to that land and nation. But God came again and said, "No, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him." It's at that time that God changed Abram's name to Abraham, meaning father of many nations. Now Abraham had a new and better promise that would come, not through Ishmael, the firstborn son, but through Isaac, who was designated by God to be Abraham's only begotten son. Hebrews 8:17 and 19 says, "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense." And Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide himself a lamb." An amazing Hebrew play on words that spoke 2,000 years into the future when God would himself become the lamb. Neither because they are the seed of Abraham are they all children, but in Isaac shall thy seed be called. That is, they which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for the seed. Beloved, what exactly is Paul saying? But that Ishmael, the firstborn, he is the son of Abraham's flesh. How could Nicodemus have known that he himself, the physical seed of Abraham in the flesh, was actually a child of Ishmael, looking into the face of Isaac, the promise? How could he have known that the circumcision of his own body was signifying that he needed to be cut off from the flesh for the spirit? The children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are given the right to become the sons of God. Nicodemus, a child of Ishmael, would now have to be born again into the family of Isaac, the only begotten. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and what is born of the Spirit is spirit.